Okay, so in the last video, I showed you guys how to create a post request, but there was a simple problem. That problem was that we didn't have any single validation, so there was no way for us to validate if the request payload slash body was actually containing the correct details. So we were actually populating our users array with a bunch of inconsistent data. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys how we can perform validation very, very simply. Okay, and we've actually done some validation already. If you actually go back to that search customer by ID as well as that get customer, when we use the parse int pipe, that actually allows us to validate that incoming parameter. So if we were to actually call this endpoint, so let's go back over here and let's just do one, right? If I were to actually provide an invalid route, invalid route parameter, you're going to see that it says validation fail. Okay, so that we technically already did some validation. And you can see on the NestJS documentation, there's a whole topic on validation, and it tells you a lot of things that NestJS provides out of the box. Now, we can use the validation pipe to make use of the class validator package, and this package is what we can use to literally perform validation with a bunch of different decorators, and you'll see how useful this is. Okay, we can validate if a property is an actual email. We can validate if the length of this string is less than 10. There's a lot of things that you can do to fit your business requirements. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to do is we will need to install class validator as well as class transformer. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Yarn add class validator and class transformer. Okay, so that shouldn't take too long to install. It's a really small package. There we go. Okay, cool. So now that we have done that, we can actually start validating our DTL. Okay, and validation is very important, especially on both front and back end. And you might run into a topic where why we should validate both on the front and back end, because isn't the user going to just make the API call from the front end because they're using the front end? Well, you never know exactly who is going to send data to the backend. Anyone can send data to your backend, unless obviously if you have it, set up by a proxy or some kind of firewall. But even then, people can still send data to your backend. And if you don't validate on the backend level and only on the front end level, you're literally opening up your backend API to a lot of security vulnerabilities. Okay? So that's why it's very important to validate at the backend level as well. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our DTO. So that's right over here. And we're going to use those decorators, those annotations, to literally just say, hey, look, let's validate these certain fields. So if I want to validate to make sure that this is an actual email, I can just use the isEmail validator. So this is the decorator. And you can read over here, it says checks if the string is an email. If given value is not a string, then it returns false. So this can pretty much validate email. Now you can also specify options too for this decorator. There's a lot of documentation I'm sure that you can find on class validator. So just make sure you check the class validator docs to find the options for what you need for your application. For the ID, we can just check to see is number string, because remember it's going to be sent over from some client, and when it travels through the network, it's going to be a string, or at least when it gets serialized into form data, it'll be a string. So we can just check to see if it's a number string, and for the name, we'll just check to see not empty is not empty. Okay. And one thing that I will mention is make sure the case is the same, because I know there are some decorators that are actually lowercase. Like if you see over here, this is not empty one. There's one that is all uppercase with each word, and there's also one that's lowercase. You want to make sure you have the one that's uppercase. Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll go into the controller, and we'll simply use the validation pipe to actually invoke validation. Now, right now, I can actually still call this endpoint. So if I do post request, I can still call this endpoint because we haven't invoked the actual validation pipe. To do that, we use the use pipes decorator on top of the controller function, and we just pass in validation pipe. Okay, so this is literally very simple. So what happens is it's going to pretty much validate everything that we have added or that we want validated in the DTO. You don't have to validate everything, okay? You can just validate whatever it is that you want. So let's click on send, and you can see that it gives us an error. It says that ID must be a number string. Okay, so that's one validation. We can also add more validation too. We can also say is not empty. So it has to be a numeric string, and it also cannot be empty. So if I click send, you're going to see that we have a ton of messages in this array. Okay, so this is actually very helpful. So you can actually display these messages you can display these error messages to the user. Well, not these directly, but you can format in a way where it looks nice to the customer. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And let's say, for example, let's provide an ID. Let's give it a value of 2. Well, actually, wait a minute. So actually, that's a problem. Let me actually do this. Let me just do is number instead. And I think this should, let's see. Seems like we have some limitation. Okay, I think that's fine. If I were to use form data, I wonder how that would work. So let me do ID 1. Or let me change the ID 2. Let me do ID 20. And let's just send that. So it seems like we do have some issues. So it seems like, yeah, it seems like this actually has to be a number string. I think we can also do, I think there's a way where you can actually do both, I think. Is number, let's see, is there another one? No. Okay. Well, we can just stick it to is number string. I think is number string would be better. Because if we send form data, that'll send it as a string. If we send raw, yeah. And we can always, like I said, we can always parse everything accordingly. Now, one more thing that you can actually do is you can actually use a transformer. So you can actually transform the request, and you can actually convert the type from a string to a number before it actually reaches the validation, which is actually really nice. Okay, but we won't get into that right now. But you can see now that we have added validation, it makes our application a lot more secure. So instead of people just sending random stuff, they have to actually send the proper request payload following the correct schema. Now, let's say, for example, if I send an invalid email, you can see that it actually validates that for us, which is really helpful. That's why I really like using this package, because it can actually validate email for us. So if I type gmail.c, you're going to see that it's going to say emails must be an email. And there you go. Pretty cool. Pretty cool way to validate stuff on the backend. All right, so that is literally how we can validate our request payload. Now here's another problem, right? What if we want to validate nested properties, right? Let's say, for example, the customer might have an address. So let's go ahead and do that. What we'll do is we'll add an address as well, and this will be an address DTO. I'll actually call this create address DTO, so that way we can reuse this maybe in the future. So, okay, export class create address.dto, and we'll type annotate this. So we want the user to, or we want the customer, let me delete this is number as well because we're not using that. So we want them to also provide a address as well when they're creating the customer. So let's say, for example, let's just say hypothetically, and let me actually do this. Let's go over here. Let's go into create address DTO. So let's go ahead and just set up a simple address. So line 1 is a string, 2 is a string. Line 2 is going to be optional actually. Zip will be a string, city string, and then states string as well. Okay, and what we can do is we can validate each one of these fields. So the address is going to be required, but we also want to make sure we validate each one of these fields as well. So we'll make sure that line 1 is not empty. We won't validate line 2 because line 2 can be empty. Okay. We'll validate zip code to be not empty as well. Same thing with city, and same thing with state. Okay, and that's all we'll do for validating the create address DTO. Now, when you want to validate nested objects, so right now, if I actually send this, you're going to see it's still going to give us a tool uncreated. If you want to validate a nested object, you actually need to use the validate nested. Okay, and what's going to happen is it's going to actually validate the nested object. But you're going to see that it still doesn't actually validate it. And the reason why is because we actually need to specify a type right over here. And we need to provide the type right over here. Just like that. Okay, so now this should actually validate it once we actually need to add the is not empty. So is not empty object. There we go. That should do the trick. So if I click send, you're gonna see address must be a non-empty object. So let's go ahead and add the address. You're gonna see that when I send the request, it's going to now tell us that address line 1, zip, city, state. That's all required. If I get rid of this is not empty object, this actually won't do anything if I send this because I don't have the is not empty object validating this. So what this does is it'll actually just validate the nested properties. It'll only validate it if the address property is actually there. So you can see that if I provide that, you'll see now it's going to validate it. Okay, so this is actually pretty useful. If, let's say, for example, the address is optional, but if the address is mandatory, then you want to make sure you add is not empty object. Okay, and now if we do not provide the address, that will tell you that address must not be an empty object. So now let's provide that, and let's go ahead and so for line 1, we'll just do 1, 2, 3. Let's do Sunny Road. Let's do let's see. Zip, we'll just do 11111. City will be New York, and state will be NY. There we go. So that works. If I get rid of state, that will tell us that state should not be empty. If I get rid of city, there we go. And that's pretty useful. So now we have validation for nested objects, and you can even imagine you can validate like deeply nested objects as well, even for the address as well. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So hopefully you guys learned how to validate your DTOs properly, and literally this is very, very, very easy to do. And you can start to see that using a framework like NestJS is very beneficial because it provides a lot of these high-level like features for us. If we were to use Express, we'd actually have to use a separate library to do everything. But there are many ways you can do it with Express, though. It's totally up to you. But personally, I like doing it this way with Nest. Anyways, so I'm going to go ahead and end this video over here. And in the next video, we'll actually dive into a little bit more of what we can actually do with NestJS. So anyways, I'm going to end the video right over here. If you guys like this video, definitely leave a like and leave a comment. And subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see you guys in my next video. Peace out.